For this first stream, we're going to be looking at rebuilding the modern CSS logo. And I have that superimposed on the bottom left of the stream screen. So I have this set up in CodePen, and it's a stripped down version from what's available on the live site, moderncss.dev. And I've just given us a starting point of the colors that are in use and initiated the web font, which is called Canet. It's from Google Fonts. And hi. And then also just kind of the basic font sizes to get us going. So the logo type for modern CSS started. Um, I wanted something bold and graphic. And so I first started by looking for a font that would fit the idea of being bold and graphic, but also have a decently iconic feeling M, a strong, bold M. So that's where I found this font. And if you visit moderncss.dev, you will see that the M gets used across article pages. It's pulled out as just that singular element. And so um, that's how this kind of began. And then I also knew that I wanted to create the logo itself with CSS to kind of fit the whole theme of and purpose of the site. So this took a lot of trial and error. I mentioned in a recent tweet that I actually end up finding a lot of solutions by just brute forcing it. So even with quite a few years of experience writing CSS for many projects, many reasons, I still find myself just kind of brute forcing it sometimes. That's what it takes, especially for something like Grid or Flexbox. Um, you can pop in chat and let me know if you also tend to rotate through all of the properties before finding the one that you're really after, particularly for Flex. um, so what ended up making the logo possible is the first thing is we set up the um, you can see that our initial HTML setup. Let me blow this up a little bit. Our initial HTML is just the H1. We've separated out the M in a span so we can style it more directly. And then kind of the unique part, the for old CSS problems, is in an M tag. So from there, our first step is to update the H1 and make it a grid container. And we'll see what that does right off the bat. If you're newer to grid, one of the things about it is that it's two-dimensional. So you can define things in rows and columns. But when you initially apply display grid, the first behavior is that it will stack into rows. So all of the separate elements you can see have been stacked as row alignment to start out with. So we could go in and define unique grid rows and columns, but we're actually going to use a feature called grid template areas. And that gets applied on the H1 as well as the sort of grid parent. And grid template areas, I'm still a little new to them. I'm able to use them enough to what I need them for. Um, but it allows you to create essentially named areas for your grid, or the possibility for named areas. And so they're defined as each value within here is a row, or excuse me, a column. And then each quoted pair, not necessarily a pair, you could have as many columns as you want, but each quoted line represents a row. So I'm going to create two rows and two columns. I'm going to name the first column M, so that will become our M location. And the rest of that row I'm going to call title. And then the syntax for this, it feels like there should be a comma here. There's not. You just do another quoted line, and I'm going to repeat M because ultimately we want the M to sit to the left and span both rows. So we'll say M again, and then create a third grid area for that we'll call subtitle. So what this has done without me assigning which area goes to which element um, is it has followed grid's normal auto flow pattern. So it's stuck M in this first M slot, the title in this M, the title slot. But since we haven't defined that M specifically takes both of these locations yet, or both of these areas yet, the subtitle has flown into this second M spot. So that makes our third step here to actually assign where each of these elements go, which grid areas they belong to. Hey, Eva, thanks for joining. So let's start assigning. So we've added the M, and that's this subtitle area. We can start with that one since we haven't created a style for the span yet. So that gets assigned with grid area, and it's the subtitle. So we will use subtitle for that to update. So we're most of the way there, and we could probably leave it that way since the autoflow has taken care of placing that M, except not quite. We want to be more explicit with it. So let's go ahead and start the span rule, which the span is the M container, and let's more explicitly assign it that grid area of M. We're not really going to see an update quite yet. So we've created our grid template areas, and we've assigned the additional elements to where we want them to go. Since we haven't explicitly wrapped the rest of this title, essentially the auto behavior of grid has taken care of that for us, and that's kind of just where it's naturally been assigned, which works out well. So the next thing that would be good to take care of is resizing this subtitle area. So let's look at that. When I started this lesson or this stream, I had already assigned the font size for the overall H1 tag. And I'm using a technique that's pretty new on scene and also isn't quite cross-browser compatible, which is the clamp function. It's very cool. I'm excited for it to achieve full support. But essentially what's happening here is, for the font size property, is that it is responsive to the viewport based on how we've set up the values here. And it's allowed to shrink down to 1.75 M, and it's allowed to grow up to 4.2 rem. And this 5 VW is essentially the multiplier, if you will, of what that's based on, the kind of size at any point, given the min and the max allowed here. So we're going to do something similar to the M so that they kind of resize proportionate to each other. We're just going to adjust the minimum and maximum values. So 5 is my minimum here, 2 rem is my max, and it's going to resize at a slightly different rate. And this kind of thing, this particular thing, is another area where brute force kind of comes in, and being able to just trial and error figure out what's going to work. So, that's a pretty nice solution. That's, that would be acceptable. But you look at our reference image in the bottom left there, there's an additional element, and that is two things. One, that the M is displayed larger, and also, and it may be hard to see, I'm going to make it a little easier in this demo to see, but there is a black diamond behind the M, just as an additional graphic element. So our next step here is to start working on the M, and let's first bump up its font size. So we'll use a font size of 2M. Now we're using M so that it is proportionate to the font size being applied to the H1. And particularly since we're using clamp, and this idea of fluid typography, M will allow us to keep proportionate without explicitly defining an additional calculation to figure out what it should be at any given time. We are going to begin to set up the um, background graphic for that, the diamond. And that is being applied as a before pseudo element on the um, span holding the M. So for any pseudo element, if you haven't used those before, a required property to get it to show up is called content. And we can leave that blank for something that's just graphical. It just needs to be present, and it's okay to be a blank value. And we'll also, our third color option up here is this color dark, and it's basically black. So we will apply that as a background color. And we're not going to see it yet. And the reason is we haven't given it anything to tell it what sort of size it should take on. And before I do that, I'm going to, I think this should work, give it an outline just to help it be visible when we start working with it. So you can actually see right there. That's what it is right now because we haven't, again, given it any size properties. There's a few ways to apply this, but the way from working on this that I found to be most scalable, yeah, clamp is it's pretty cool. I have an article on modern CSS related to fluid typography, and we use it as, or we skip using it in favor of min max. You can check out why, but I was finding that interestingly, um, in my own testing, it was perfectly fine on Chrome, which I'm using here, but not on Chrome mobile on iOS. And so that alone was enough to make me not actually use it or require a fallback for it for the time being. So one to keep an eye on. Um, cool. So for sizing the before element, um, I have in previous instances continued with this grid template ideas versus um, an old standby, which is positioning absolutely. And I started to go down that path, but because I already had grid areas defined and just some other things about kind of relative sizing, I ended up still having to go with position relative. I'd be super interested if anybody kind of tries walking through this in a similar solution, um, if you find an alternate method, but did end up having to still use absolute positioning. So the first thing we need to do to make that work is to ensure that we have, for our span that contains the M, assign it to position relative. And that will mean that once we assign the before as position absolute, that it is relative to the span. Otherwise, it would be relative to another ancestor, which in this case would be the body. And okay, so the other thing, so we're going to start sizing it. And a lot of times when you start to use position absolute, you go down the path of like top 0, left 0, width 100%, height 100%. And that's close. That's close. But we'd have to do some math to figure out how to make it a square and make it a scalable square. Excuse me. So I started thinking about one of the hacks that's available for aspect ratio sizing. And that hack involves, rather than assigning explicit height and width, to base it off the padding property. So let's try that. So I'll start with just a random value here. So if you can see that, it's given us a square because it's computing the padding kind of from all sides, which there's some magic math going on here that I actually haven't figured out why this is working so well for me. But in terms of making it a square, but it's a square and I'll take it. So it just kind of arrived at that as a potential solution and then sized it up um, until kind of visual preference. And I realize what kind of makes this make sense is if we're designing in pixels rather than um, in the browser, rather than designing in pixels in a design program. But a lot of like the positioning idea kind of transfers. You just start thinking about it in CSS properties versus kind of nudging it around with your mouse. So that helps for me mentally, the kind of relative sizing make a little more sense. Um, so a padding of 70%. And you can see that we're covering up our M. And so we'll use a good old Z index to knock that behind. Wait for that to update. Cool. So we're getting a lot of the way there with what we want. The final thing to take care of for the diamond is to figure out how to make the square into a diamond. And this is where we get to use the transform property. And the super fast way to make this happen, given that we know that we have a perfect square in use here, is to use the rotate property. And I chose to use 45 degrees. And however, our alignment isn't quite right. And this is where it gets a little more difficult to think about. This is where I versus a program helps this make a little more sense too. Is we need to nudge it. We need to move it just a little bit. I tried playing around with transform origin, and by default, this transforms from the center of the element. I'm trying to like point it there, but from the center of the element. And so I did with that, like top left, for example, or tried to move it around and tried to make it make a little more sense. But I think our padding idea is throwing that out a little bit. What I ended up going with as a solution for this instance was, in addition to rotate, I'm also adding translate specifically of the X axis. And I'll really blow it out just to demonstrate. Whoops. For that to update. So because we've already rotated the element, it changes a little bit what this means for X. Since we've done a rotate of a quarter turn, which is going to be in this direction, our X now runs like this. So I gave it a negative 40%, and that percentage is relative to the size of the element, which can be very useful. It's another way you can hack around centering elements. So 40%, that was a little too much, but okay, just a reminder, we're moving along right here. And so we'll take it back a little bit, and the value that ended up ultimately working was 20%. But I realized I forgot a step here. You'll notice we have more extra space in here than we really want. We want these to sit tight together. And that was really stumping me for a while, until I finally realized that it was good old line height getting in the way. And on this CodePen, I am pulling in the normalize reset. It's also applying auto prefixer. So there are a few properties, like if you were to pop in and look at them, they do ultimately need prefixes, but they're available. And so normalize, I'm not sure let's double check what it's setting the line height as. Possibly just 1. Harder to inspect this with code. Yeah, 1.15. So we need to supply a custom line height. The knee-jerk reaction I had was, well, I just don't want line height at all. I want it to be based just on the height here. Well, that doesn't quite work, because 0 means literally 0. You can see what happened there. That was a bit of a fail. So again, it took a little trial and error to find it out, and I ended up with 0.8 as the line height here. So 1 is too much. You can see, so it was kind of just backing off until basically just until it felt right. Again, designing in the browser. So again, let's check out what happens when we resize. Um, Reminder that we have that fluid typography rules in place. And so those are helping it resize down pretty nicely. There's an eventual point, there we go, where it breaks. And the one thing I didn't quite get solved is, so right here, here's our 320, which I still use as a reference point for what I consider the smallest mobile size. As we know, that's quite a range at this point. Um, and I wish that I could center this horizontally. But what's happening here is um, is the row that is created with grid is still taking up that full width. Back out here. So it's taking up that full width. And so trying to apply things like justify or text center um, has negative results for what we're actually trying to do. So if anybody has a way around that um, to figure out how to kind of shrink that to the width itself, I think it's getting blown out because of the fact this is wrapping. And so it's kind of messing with the box layout algorithm, but that could be a wrong assumption. Let me know if you have a solution for that. The last thing, just kind of finessing at this point. Um, so on the H1, I also added in some letter spacing, and my value here was 0.04 M. That feels a little better there, but then we adjusted again for explicitly the value. So that pretty much concludes how that was created. Um, Grid areas, my other favorite trick with that is to use it for single cells. Again, as kind of a hack around absolute positioning. If you assign everything to a single cell, then you can use transforms and so forth instead of um, so that the repositionings are relative to the element scale rather than trying to define top, left, right, bottom of a bunch of inner elements and running into resize issues. So I might do an article or another live more specifically on that technique. So I've mentioned several times that was produced through some trial and error. We really have a couple more minutes here, so feel free to pop any questions that I can do in the last couple of minutes. Um, but the values that I've supplied here work for specifically the M in specifically this font at specifically this weight. And the M is nicely a square element. So even in the same font, if I switch to a very narrow letter, like an I, wait for that to update, I retain the square that was produced. However, there needs to be some additional work on resizing it specifically for this letter. Unfortunately, it's not like a um, completely scalable solution. It's a very one-off solution. But for something like a logo type, that that was acceptable for me, particularly for this project, where I'm not expecting it necessarily to be reused, and it's truly one thing where I'm designing with code, which is fun. And um, my tip for this, though, is if you try to do something similar and you run into a similar issue, the padding is still a great way to go to scale this element. But what might start to get a little easier to understand, since we are ultimately absolute positioning this, is instead of using translates, because in this case, we'd probably want to translate X and also Y. Um, Instead of that, what doesn't get rotated in terms of trying to think about the axis in use is your top left, right, bottom. So um, in this case, you could do a left of, we'll just see how this works. But what I'm trying to say is left still equates to left. It doesn't equate to like this side. So for these finer grained adjustments, um, you may choose to still use the absolute kind of position related properties. And you can see that still manages to scale, which is good. Cool. Well, that is all I have. Ooh, that is all I have for this lesson. But thank you so much for joining. So let me know if any other topics you'd like me to cover. And wasn't too bad. Might try it again. So thanks again for joining.